My brother had just orchestrated the sale of our 600-acre family farm, $9.2 million. And to do it, he manipulated our father into signing the contract, a man whose mind was slipping so badly he often couldn't remember what happened 5 minutes ago. Everyone assumed I had no legal right to the land. 11 years ago, at my grandfather's funeral, the will they read didn't have my name on it anywhere. The land went to my dad, and my brother was appointed the unquestioned manager. So, when Dale was shaking hands with a corporate development company right in our kitchen, nobody thought my signature would ever be needed. I had no idea about his dirty trick. None of it. But exactly 3 days later, inside an old curing barn that had been padlocked for 11 years, sitting in the dark and the dust, I found something. A rusted tin box, and the paper I pulled out of it changed the entire world beneath my feet. It was another will, not the one read at the funeral. This one was dated 2 years later, and a single line on that page, a single name, turned my brother's $9 million deceit into a worthless piece of trash, because the name written on that paper was mine. I didn't call him that night. I didn't call anyone. I just walked out of that barn feeling a kind of fierce strength I had never known in my entire life. If you enjoy stories about family secrets, quiet strength, and the moment the truth finally comes home to roost, stay with me until the end, because what I did with that will changed everything for all of us. And if this story moves you, please take a moment to subscribe to this small channel of ours. It genuinely means the world to us. My name is Hazel Whitmore, and for most of my life, this farm has been the only thing that ever made complete sense to me. I grew up on 600 acres outside a small town in western Kentucky, land that had belonged to my family for 3 generations before I was even born. My grandfather, Walter Whitmore, ran cattle and grew tobacco in the early years, then transitioned most of the acreage to hay and grain as the tobacco market collapsed. My father, Russell, took over management in his 30s, and by the time I was old enough to remember anything, the rhythm of that farm was simply the rhythm of my whole life. Sunrise chores, the smell of the barn, my grandfather's slow, deliberate way of explaining things twice, once with words, and once by letting you do it yourself and get it wrong. I have an older brother, Dale, 6 years ahead of me, and from as far back as I can remember, the farm's future was understood to belong to him. Not because anyone sat us down and said it outright, but because of 1,000 small signals that added up the same way water carves a channel into stone. Dale got the truck for his 16th birthday. I got a hand-me-down bicycle with a basket. Dale was taken to equipment auctions and cattle sales, introduced to buyers, given a seat at the table when decisions were discussed. I was, more often than not, told to go help my grandmother in the kitchen. I loved animals with an intensity that worried my mother a little, honestly. I could tell you which cow was off her feed before anyone else noticed, could read the particular way a dog held its tail when something was wrong long before it became obvious. My grandfather noticed that in me early, and it became our thing, quietly, without announcement. While Dale learned equipment maintenance and grain markets, I learned, almost by accident, the beginning of veterinary medicine, standing beside my grandfather in the barn at 2 a.m. during a difficult calving, watching him work with a calm patience that made everything feel less frightening. I went on to veterinary school, the first person in our family to leave the farm for any extended period, funded through scholarships and loans I'm still paying off today. I want to pause here for just a moment, because before I continue, I'd be so grateful if you'd take a second to subscribe to this small channel of ours. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and I promise there's a meaningful story waiting for you at the end of this one. Now, let's continue. I came back after graduation, not because anyone asked me to, but because I couldn't imagine practicing anywhere else. I opened a small, large animal practice in town, and within a year, I was doing more work on my own family's farm than any hired vet ever had, treating our cattle, managing herd health, handling everything from difficult births to routine checkups, all folded quietly into the free labor category, the way family help always seems to be. My grandfather had a mild stroke the year I turned 29, nothing catastrophic, but enough to slow him considerably. In the years that followed, before he passed, I became the person who actually ran the day-to-day operation of that farm, alongside my veterinary practice, while Dale focused on what he called the business side, though what that actually meant in practice was never entirely clear to me. When my grandfather passed away, 11 years ago now, the will that was read named my father as primary heir to the land, with instructions that it remain in the family and be managed jointly by his children when the time came. Dale, as the elder sibling, took on the title of farm manager. I kept doing what I had always done, the actual physical and medical work of keeping that land productive, while my name appeared on no deed, no title, nothing beyond an unspoken assumption that I would simply keep showing up. What I didn't know then, sitting in that lawyer's office listening to a will I had no reason to question, was that my grandfather had gone back to that same attorney 2 years before his death and quietly changed his mind about something important. The years after my grandfather's death settled into a pattern I didn't examine too closely at the time. My father, increasingly focused on his own declining health, stepped back from daily involvement. Dale took on the title of manager with visible pride, attending Farm Bureau meetings, negotiating equipment leases, representing the family at agricultural events around the county. I kept doing the work that never had a title attached to it. Calving season meant weeks of interrupted sleep, driving out to the farm after full days at my clinic to check on cows in labor. I managed vaccination schedules, treated injuries, made the calls on which animals to cull and which to keep breeding, all of it woven into my regular practice without ever being formally acknowledged as part of the farm's operational structure. Dale, to be fair, worked hard in his own way. He wasn't lazy, but there was a particular kind of work he gravitated toward, the kind that came with recognition attached. He loved standing at the front of a Farm Bureau meeting discussing commodity prices. He loved the handshake deals with equipment dealers, the visibility of representing Whitmore Farm at county events. What he never seemed drawn to was the unglamorous, unrecognized labor of actually keeping 400 head of cattle alive and healthy, work that happened mostly in the dark, in the mud, in weather nobody wanted to be out in. At family gatherings, the language around the farm had a particular shape that took me years to fully notice. Dale ran the farm. I helped out with the animals. It wasn't malicious, exactly. It was just how the story had been told for so long that everyone, including me for longer than I'd like to admit, had stopped questioning whether it was accurate. About 3 years ago, land values in our part of the county started climbing sharply. A new highway interchange had been approved 12 miles east, and development companies began quietly buying up agricultural land throughout the region. Land that had been farmed for generations, suddenly worth more as future subdivisions and commercial lots than it had ever been worth growing hay. I noticed Dale becoming increasingly interested in these conversations at Farm Bureau meetings, the kind of interest that felt different from his usual commodity price discussions. He started mentioning numbers, casually, at family dinners, what our land might be worth per acre if it were rezoned, what certain neighboring farms had sold for. I assumed, honestly, that this was just Dale being Dale, the part of him that always liked talking about big numbers and big deals, even when nothing concrete was actually happening. I want to pause again for a moment here, because before I continue, I'd be so grateful if you'd take a second to subscribe to this small channel of ours. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and I promise, there's a meaningful story waiting for you at the end of this one. Now, back to it. About 8 months ago, my father's health took a serious turn, A series of small strokes that left him increasingly confused, increasingly dependent on family to manage even basic decisions. Dale, as the one holding the manager title, began handling more and more of the administrative side of the farm's affairs. Paperwork I paid very little attention to at the time, because I was, as always, focused on keeping the actual animals alive. What I didn't know, treating cattle in the mud at 5 in the morning while Dale sat in air-conditioned offices with men in polo shirts and clipboards, was that those meetings had stopped being casual conversations about land value months earlier. The first hint that something was genuinely wrong came on an ordinary Thursday, the kind of day I wouldn't have remembered at all if not for what happened next. I'd stopped by the farm to check on a heifer who'd had a rough delivery a few days earlier, and I noticed a car in the driveway I didn't recognize, a clean black sedan, out of place next to our mud-splattered trucks. Through the kitchen window, I could see Dale sitting at our old farm table with 2 men in business casual clothes, papers spread out between them, a laptop open. I almost didn't go in. I remember standing by my truck for a moment, telling myself it was probably just another equipment dealer, another routine conversation I wasn't part of because I never had been part of those conversations. But something about the body language through that window stopped me. The way the older of the 2 men kept tapping a pen against a specific page. The way Dale kept glancing toward the door, like he was watching for someone. I walked in without knocking, the way I always had my entire life in that house, and the conversation stopped so abruptly it was almost comedic, if it hadn't felt so wrong. Dale stood up too quickly, nearly knocking over his coffee. The 2 men introduced themselves as representatives from a development firm out of Louisville, Meridian Land Partners, here to discuss what they called a preliminary land assessment. I asked, as calmly as I could manage, what exactly was being assessed. Dale gave me a version of an answer that told me almost nothing, something about exploring options, understanding the farm's full financial potential. Nothing set in stone. The 2 men were polite, professional, careful not to say too much in front of someone whose role in all of this clearly hadn't been explained to them. I want to pause here for a moment, because before I continue, I'd be so grateful if you'd take a second to subscribe to this small channel of ours. It genuinely helps more than you'd think, and there's a lot more of this story still to come. I let it go that day, mostly because I genuinely believed Dale when he said nothing was decided. I drove home telling myself I was overreacting, that exploring options was exactly that, exploring, nothing more. 2 weeks later, I found out how wrong I'd been, though not from Dale. I found out from Ruth Calloway, our neighbor of 30 years, who called me on a Sunday evening sounding hesitant in a way that immediately worried me. She'd heard, through her son who worked at the county recorder's office, that a purchase agreement involving Whitmore Farm had been filed. 600 acres, Meridian Land Partners listed as the buyer. I sat with that information for a long moment before I could even respond to her. A purchase agreement, not an assessment, not exploring options. An actual filed document. I drove to the county recorder's office myself the next morning, and what I found there changed the entire shape of the ground beneath me, quite literally. The purchase agreement listed my father as the seller, his signature at the bottom, dated 3 weeks earlier, the same week I'd walked in on that meeting at the kitchen table. My father, who by that point could barely remember what he'd eaten for breakfast some mornings, had apparently signed away 600 acres of family land in a state of mind that made me deeply uneasy the moment I thought about it clearly. I didn't confront Dale immediately. I want to be honest about that, because at the time, some part of me still needed to believe there was an explanation that didn't involve what I was starting to suspect. Instead, I did something that felt strange and almost like a betrayal of the trust our family had always operated on. Though I understand now, it was the opposite of betrayal. I made a copy of that purchase agreement at the recorder's office, and I drove straight to see my father. Finding him having what I'd call a clear day, took some patience. His good hours had become less predictable over the previous months, but that Tuesday afternoon, sitting on the porch with a cup of coffee going cold beside him, he seemed present, engaged, recognizably himself. I showed him the document gently, watching his face as he looked at the signature at the bottom of the page. And what I saw wasn't recognition. It was confusion. Genuine, unguarded confusion. The kind that cannot be performed convincingly by someone who actually remembers signing something. He asked me what this was. He asked me, with a note of real fear creeping into his voice, whether he'd done something wrong. I sat with him for a long time that afternoon, holding his hand, telling him it was going to be okay, even though I had no idea yet whether that was true. What became clear over the following days, piecing together fragments from my father during his clearer moments, along with a conversation I had with his primary care physician, was troubling in a way that went beyond a simple business disagreement. My father had very little clear memory of signing that agreement at all. He recalled Dale visiting with some papers, recalled feeling pressured, recalled being told repeatedly that this was simply what needed to happen to protect the family's financial future. He did not recall understanding, in any meaningful way, that he was agreeing to sell the entire farm. I want to pause again for a moment, because before I go further, I'd be so grateful if you'd take a second to subscribe to this small channel of ours. It truly helps more than you'd think, and I promise, the most important part of this story is still ahead of us. I confronted Dale 3 days later, not with accusations, but with questions. Careful ones. The kind I'd learned to ask handling difficult conversations with worried pet owners over the years. I asked him directly whether he understood Dad's current mental state when that agreement was signed. Dale's response told me everything I needed to know about how far this had already gone. He didn't deny knowing about Dad's condition. He simply reframed it, told me I was being dramatic, that Dad understood plenty when it mattered, that someone needed to make decisive choices about this farm's future before land values shifted again, and that he was the one who'd been carrying that responsibility for over a decade, while I, in his words, played veterinarian on the side. Played veterinarian on the side, 11 years of calving seasons, of 2 a.m. emergencies, of every single medical decision that kept that herd alive and that farm financially viable, reduced to a hobby in my own brother's mouth. I asked him directly what the plan actually was. And for the first time, Dale laid it out plainly, almost proudly. Meridian was offering $9.2 million for the full 600 acres, a number so far beyond anything any of us had ever discussed that I genuinely struggled to process it, standing there in our father's kitchen. The sale was set to close in 11 weeks. Dale's plan, as he explained it, was to use a portion of the proceeds to buy a smaller property nearby, something more manageable, he said, and split the rest of the money between us, according to what he called a fair arrangement he'd already worked out with a financial advisor. A fair arrangement he had already worked out, without me, without any real conversation with our father, in the state our father was actually in, rather than the state Dale found convenient to believe he was in. I left that conversation with a single thought circling in my mind, one that would not let go of me for days afterward. Whatever protection our family thought existed around this land, whatever unspoken promise my grandfather believed he'd built into that will he signed 11 years ago, none of it was going to be enough to stop this, unless I found something concrete, something undeniable, before those 11 weeks ran out. The ticking clock of those 11 weeks felt like a physical weight on my chest. Every morning I woke up, the sun rising over the lower pasture looked different to me. It didn't look like home anymore. It looked like a countdown. My first instinct was to fight Dale through the legal system. I made an appointment with an attorney in town, a woman named Sarah, whose horses I'd been treating for years. Sitting in her office, with its polished mahogany desk and the hum of the air conditioner, I felt entirely out of my element. I explained everything: my father's declining memory, the sudden appearance of the developers, Dale's rushed timeline. Sarah was compassionate, but the reality she laid out for me was harsh. Contesting a signed commercial real estate contract based on elder competency is a long, ugly, and terribly expensive process. Because Dale had been acting as the de facto manager, and because my father hadn't been officially declared incompetent by a judge. Before he signed the papers, Meridian Land Partners had every legal right to push the sale forward. "Hazel," Sarah had said gently, folding her hands on her desk, "unless you have something concrete, a power of attorney that predates the signing, or a document proving Dale didn't have the legal right to facilitate this, you are looking at a battle that will bankrupt you long before you save the farm." I left her office feeling a kind of hollow despair I had never experienced before. I drove back to the clinic, went through the motions of my day, treating a colicky foal, doing routine vaccinations, but my mind was entirely consumed by the realization that my family's legacy was slipping through my fingers, and I was utterly powerless to stop it. I want to pause here for just a moment, because before I tell you what happened next, I'd be so grateful if you'd take a second to subscribe to this small channel of ours. It genuinely helps us continue bringing you these stories, and I promise, the journey we are on together is about to take a turn you won't expect. Thank you for being here. Let's continue. That evening, I didn't go back to my own house. I drove out to the farm. I needed to be near the land. I parked my truck by the front gate and just walked. I walked past the main house where my father was likely sleeping in his chair. I walked past the new equipment sheds Dale had built, and eventually, I found myself standing in front of the old eastern barn. This barn had been my grandfather Walter's sanctuary. When he transitioned the farm away from tobacco, this old curing barn became his personal workshop. But after he passed away 11 years ago, Dale had deemed the building structurally obsolete. He slapped a heavy padlock on the front doors and told everyone it was a safety hazard. It had sat untouched ever since, slowly surrendering to the ivy and the weather. I stood there, looking at that rusted padlock, and suddenly, a memory washed over me so vividly it took my breath away. I was 17, covered in mud, from helping pull a calf in a rainstorm. My grandfather had handed me a towel, looked me dead in the eye, and said, "Hazel, this land doesn't belong to the person whose name is on the bank account. It belongs to the person whose sweat is in the soil. Don't you ever let anyone tell you different. And when the time comes, you'll know where to look." You'll know where to look. For 11 years, I thought he was just speaking metaphorically. But standing there in the fading twilight, my heart started to pound against my ribs. I turned around, marched to my truck, and dug through the old toolbox behind the passenger seat until my fingers brushed against a heavy set of bolt cutters. I didn't care if Dale found out. I didn't care about being polite anymore. I walked back to that old barn, clamped the heavy steel jaws of the cutters around the rusted padlock, and pushed down with every ounce of strength I had left. The padlock gave way with a sharp, echoing snap that sent a flock of starlings scattering from the roof. I pulled the heavy iron chain through the handles and heaved the large, groaning wooden doors open. The air inside was thick and still, carrying the deep, sweet scent of aged timber, dried hay, and old machinery grease. It smelled exactly like my grandfather. It smelled like my childhood. I stood in the doorway, letting my eyes adjust to the dim light filtering through the gaps in the roof. Dust motes danced in the fading evening sun, and for a moment, I just let myself breathe it all in. I wasn't entirely sure what I was looking for. I just knew I had to search. I spent the first hour going through the old workbench, opening coffee cans full of rusted nails, sifting through ancient veterinary logs, and checking the drawers of his old metal desk. Nothing. Just the forgotten relics of a man who had loved this land more than he loved himself. By the time the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, haunting shadows across the dirt floor, I was exhausted. I sat down on an overturned bucket, wiping a mixture of sweat and decades-old dust from my forehead. Had I imagined it? Had my desperate mind just invented a hidden meaning in an old man's comforting words? I looked up toward the hayloft. The wooden ladder was precarious, a few rungs missing, completely unsafe by any standard. But I remembered how my grandfather used to climb up there when he wanted to be entirely alone. It was his quiet place. I want to pause here for just one more moment. If you are enjoying this story about quiet strength and fighting for what is right, please take a second to subscribe to our small channel. Your support means the absolute world to us, and the secret waiting in that hayloft is something I want to share with all of you. Now, let's go up that ladder. I tested my weight on the first wooden rung. It held, slowly, carefully. I made my way up into the loft. The heat up there was stifling, and the dust was thick enough to write my name in. I crawled on my hands and knees across the old, wide plank floorboards, pressing my hands against the wood, searching for something, anything, that felt out of place. Right at the back wall, tucked under the lowest part of the sloping roof, I found it. One of the thick oak floorboards didn't sit flush with the others. My breath hitched. I wedged my fingers into the tiny gap, ignoring the splinter that dug into my thumb, and pulled. The board lifted with a soft creak. Beneath it, nestled in a hollowed-out space between the joists, was a tin box. The corners were rusted, and the lid was covered in a thick layer of grime. My hands were shaking as I pulled it out. I sat back on the dusty floor, resting the cold tin on my lap. I didn't want to open it right away. Part of me was terrified that it would just be old photographs, or letters, things that were sentimental but completely useless against a $9 million corporate buyout. But I took a deep breath, and I pried the lid off. Inside, wrapped carefully in a layer of clear plastic, were several folded pieces of thick, legal stock paper. I pulled them out, my eyes struggling to read the formal text in the dimming light. But as I scanned the pages, the words began to come into sharp, unbelievable focus. It was a last will and testament, but it wasn't the one that had been read at my grandfather's funeral 11 years ago. This one was dated 2 years later, just months before his first stroke. I skipped the legal jargon and went straight to the declarations. My heart stopped. The document stated, in clear, undeniable language, that upon his death, ownership of the 600 acres of Whitmore Farm was not to go to my father, as the original will had stated. Instead, the land was placed into an irrevocable trust, and the sole, unquestioned executor and beneficiary of that trust, with absolute authority over the sale, division, or management of the property, was me, Hazel Whitmore. At the bottom of the final page, bold and certain, was my grandfather's signature. Next to it was the signature of a notary public and the stamp of a legal firm out of Nashville, not the local lawyer my family had always used. He had gone out of town to do this. He had hidden it here because he knew my father was weak. He knew Dale was ambitious, and he knew, somehow, that a day like this would come. I sat alone in that hayloft until the light went orange, and then deep blue through the slats of the roof. I held the papers to my chest. I didn't call Dale. I didn't call my father. I didn't call anyone. I just sat there, holding the absolute proof that for my entire life I had not been invisible. My grandfather had seen me, and starting tomorrow, my brother was going to see me too. You know, there is a very specific kind of quiet that falls over a farm just before the sun comes up. It's a peaceful, waiting kind of quiet. I didn't sleep at all that night. I sat at my kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee. The Nashville will spread out in front of me under the harsh yellow light of the stove hood. I must have read those pages 50 times, terrified that if I blinked, the words would change. But they didn't change. My grandfather, in his quiet, deliberate way, had seen exactly what was coming. Because he had hidden this document so well, 11 years ago, the local courts had simply processed the older, outdated will, the one everyone knew about. But this new document, signed, notarized, and legally filed in a different county, superseded everything. At 8 o'clock the next morning, I was waiting in the parking lot of my attorney's office before she had even unlocked the front doors. Sarah looked surprised to see me back so soon. She ushered me into her office, offering me coffee, which I politely declined. My hands were shaking too much to hold a mug anyway. Without saying a word, I slid the plastic-wrapped pages across her polished mahogany desk. I watched her face as she read. I watched her brow furrow, then lift in surprise. I watched her flip to the signature page, trace her pen over the notary stamp, and pull up a legal database on her computer to check the filing records in Nashville. I want to pause our story for just a brief moment here. If you are enjoying this journey of uncovering family secrets and finding inner strength, please take a second to subscribe to our small channel. Your support truly warms our hearts and helps us bring these stories to life. Thank you so much for listening. Now, let's see what Sarah had to say. The silence in that office stretched out for what felt like an eternity. Finally, Sarah took off her reading glasses, leaned back in her leather chair, and looked at me with a smile that I will never, for the rest of my life, forget. "Hazel," she said, her voice filled with a quiet kind of awe. "This is a fully executed, irrevocable trust. It is ironclad. Do you understand what this means?" I swallowed hard. "It means the farm is mine?" "It means," Sarah corrected gently, "that the farm has always been yours. From the moment your grandfather passed, this land belonged to a trust that only you control, which means your father never actually owned it." She tapped the purchase agreement Dale had forced my dad to sign. "And you cannot sell what you do not legally own. This $9 million contract Dale orchestrated with Meridian Land Partners, it isn't just contestable, Hazel. It is completely, legally void. It isn't worth the paper it's printed on." I drove back to the clinic that morning, feeling lighter than I had in a decade. The heavy, suffocating weight of those 11 weeks had vanished, but the hardest part was still ahead of me. I couldn't just tell Dale over the phone. I couldn't just leave a copy of the will on the kitchen table. For my entire life, my brother had spoken for our family. He had claimed the title, the authority, and the respect, while I quietly did the work in the mud and the cold. If I was going to stop this sale, if I was going to step into the role my grandfather had chosen for me, I needed to do it exactly where Dale felt the most powerful. I checked my calendar. Meridian Land Partners was coming back to the farm on Friday for a final land survey before the closing. I decided right then. I wasn't going to just stop the sale. I was going to stop the lie we had been living for 11 years. Friday morning arrived with a cool, crisp breeze, the kind of autumn day my grandfather used to love. I didn't wear my coveralls, and I didn't wear my muddy work boots. I put on a clean pair of dark jeans, a crisp button-down shirt, and a tailored jacket. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see the quiet sister who always stepped aside. I saw Walter Whitmore's granddaughter. When I pulled up to the main house, there were 3 pristine SUVs parked in the driveway. Dale was standing on the front porch, holding a rolled-up set of blueprints, laughing loudly with 4 men in expensive suits. The Meridian representatives. They were pointing out toward the lower pastures, tracing imaginary lines in the air where roads and subdivisions would soon pave over our family's history. I walked up the gravel driveway. My boots crunched loudly, drawing their attention. Dale's smile faltered for just a fraction of a second when he saw me, but he quickly recovered, putting on that patronizing, older brother voice he had perfected over the years. "Hazel," Dale said, stepping forward as if to block my path to the corporate men. "We're in the middle of a business meeting here. Can this wait? Are we out of feed again? I want to pause here for just a quick moment." If you're cheering for Hazel as she finally stands her ground, please take a second to hit that subscribe button. We are a small channel, and your subscription means everything to us. I promise. The look on Dale's face is something you won't want to miss. Let's get back to the porch. I didn't stop walking until I was standing on the top step, eye level with the men in the suits. I didn't look at Dale. I looked directly at the oldest Meridian representative, the one who had been tapping his pen at the kitchen table weeks ago. "Good morning," I said, my voice steady and calm. "I'm Dr. Hazel Whitmore. I understand you're here to finalize the survey for the purchase of this property." The man smiled politely, offering his hand. "Yes, ma'am. We're just going over the final topography reports with your brother. Everything is moving along perfectly." "I'm afraid there's been a miscommunication," I said, ignoring his outstretched hand and pulling a thick, manila folder from my bag. "My brother does not have the legal authority to sell this land. Nor does my father." Dale let out a sharp, dismissive laugh. "Hazel, what are you doing? Go back to the clinic. You're embarrassing yourself." "Gentlemen, I apologize. My sister doesn't understand the legal." "Actually, Dale, I understand it perfectly," I interrupted, and for the first time in my life, I raised my voice to him. The sheer authority in it shocked him into silence. I handed the manila folder directly to the Meridian executive. "Inside, you will find a certified copy of my grandfather's final, legally binding will, filed in Nashville, placing these 600 acres into an irrevocable trust. You will also find a letter from my attorney. The trust dictates that I, and I alone, am the sole executor and beneficiary. My father's signature on your purchase agreement is legally meaningless." The corporate executive's polite smile vanished. He opened the folder, his eyes scanning the legal jargon, landing on the notary stamps and the clear, undeniable language of the trust. In the corporate world, they don't care about family drama. They care about liability. And looking at that paper, the man knew instantly that he was looking at a massive legal wall. "Dale," the executive said, his voice suddenly ice cold, handing the folder toward my brother. "What is this?" Dale snatched the papers. I watched the color drain completely from his face as he read our grandfather's signature. His hands started to shake. This is a fake," he stammered, looking up at me with a mixture of rage and pure panic. "He wouldn't do this. He wouldn't give it to you." "He did," I said softly, feeling the phantom weight of my grandfather's hand resting on my shoulder. "Because he knew you'd sell it the first chance you got, and he knew I would stay." I looked at the Meridian executives, who were already awkwardly packing up their blueprints and moving toward their SUVs. "The survey is canceled, gentlemen. You can find your way off my property." The silence that fell over the driveway as those black SUVs crunched their way down the gravel and out toward the main highway was absolute. I stood on the porch, my hands trembling just a little, the manila folder still in my grip. Dale didn't look at me at first. He stood there, staring at the dust settling at the end of the road, watching his $9 million deal evaporate into the morning air. When he finally turned to me, I expected him to yell. I expected rage. But what I saw instead was a kind of desperate, defensive panic. "You can't do this, Hazel," he said, his voice tight. "You have no idea what it takes to manage the finances of a place this size. Dad's medical bills are only going to get higher. The taxes, the equipment maintenance. I was trying to save us from going under. I was trying to take care of this family." I looked at my older brother, really looked at him, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small in his shadow. I just felt sad. "Dale," I said, my voice softer now, but completely unwavering. "I am the one who balances the vet bills. I'm the one who knows exactly what our herd yields at auction. The farm has been operating at a profit for 6 years, a profit you've been using to lease equipment we don't need, just so you can look successful at Farm Bureau meetings. He opened his mouth to argue, but I didn't let him. Dad's care will be paid for, I continued. The trust accounts for all of it. Grandpa made sure of that. But you aren't going to sell off the land our grandfather bled for, just to put millions in your own pocket, while pretending it's for Dad's benefit. I want to pause here for just a moment. If you have ever had to stand your ground and have a difficult conversation with someone you love, you know how heavy this moment feels. If Hazel's strength resonates with you, please take a second to subscribe to this small channel. We have built such a wonderful community of strong women here, and your support means everything. Let's finish this conversation. Dale looked down at his boots. The fight had drained right out of him. He knew I had seen the paperwork. He knew I had spoken to Sarah. There was nowhere left for him to hide behind his title of farm manager. So what now? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. You just kick me out? After everything I've done? No, I replied, shaking my head. You're my brother, Dale. There's a generous cash provision in the trust for you, which Sarah will distribute. You can buy that smaller property you wanted. You can be your own boss. But you don't make the decisions here anymore. You never really did. I turned and walked through the front door, leaving him standing alone on the porch. I found my father sitting in his favorite armchair by the window in the living room. He had a blanket over his knees, and he was watching a pair of cardinals at the bird feeder outside. When I walked in, he looked up, and for a fleeting, beautiful moment, his eyes were perfectly clear. I knelt down beside his chair and took his worn, wrinkled hand in mine. Did you get it sorted out, Hazel? He asked quietly. Tears finally spilled over my eyelashes, hot and fast, tracing paths through the faint layer of barn dust still clinging to my cheek. I did, Dad. I got it sorted out. We aren't going anywhere. The farm is safe. He smiled, a slow, gentle smile, and patted my hand. Good, he murmured, looking back out the window. Your grandpa would be proud of you, Hazelnut. Always knew you had the grit for it. It has been 8 months since that morning on the porch. Spring has returned to western Kentucky, and with it, the beautiful, exhausting chaos of calving season. But this year, things are different. The legal transition went exactly as Sarah predicted. Because the trust was irrevocable and predated my father's cognitive decline by years, the Meridian Land Partners contract was officially dissolved. They didn't even try to fight it. They simply moved on to the next county. Dale took his portion of the trust's cash assets and bought a modest 50-acre property a few towns over. We don't talk much these days. He came by for Thanksgiving, and we were polite to one another, but the old dynamic is gone. I hope, someday, he finds whatever it is he's looking for, but I can no longer let his ambition dictate my life. As for the farm, it is thriving. Now that I have legal control, I was able to hire 2 full-time farmhands, a wonderful young couple from town, to help with the heavy lifting and daily maintenance. That freed me up to keep running my veterinary practice without working myself into the ground. Dad's health is still declining, but he is at peace. We brought in a full-time, in-home nurse to help him during the day. He gets to sit on his own porch, looking out at the same green pastures he's known his entire life. He will spend his final years exactly where he belongs. Before we close our story today, I want to take a moment to thank you. If you have stayed with me through this entire journey, please consider subscribing to our channel. Leaving a comment or hitting the subscribe button helps us share these deeply human stories with more people who might need to hear them. Thank you, truly, from the bottom of my heart. Yesterday evening, just as the sun was beginning to set, I walked out to the eastern barn. I left the heavy wooden doors open this time. The old tin box is back in the hayloft, though it's empty now. The will is safely locked in Sarah's office vault, but I like knowing the hiding spot is still there. I stood in the center of the dirt floor, breathing in the smell of old timber and dried hay. I remembered what my grandfather had told me all those years ago, standing in the mud and the rain. This land doesn't belong to the person whose name is on the bank account. It belongs to the person whose sweat is in the soil. He was right. It was never about the title. It was never about the meetings or the handshakes. It was about showing up, day after day, in the dark and the cold, out of pure love for the life we were given. My name is Hazel Whitmore. I am a veterinarian. I am a daughter. And I am, officially and forever, the steward of Whitmore Farm. And no one is ever locking this barn again. Thank you so much for spending your time with me today and listening to Hazel's story. It is never easy to stand up to the people we love, but sometimes protecting our family's legacy requires a quiet kind of courage we didn't even know we had. If this story touched your heart, please let me know by leaving a comment below. I read every single one, and I would absolutely love to hear from you. Have you ever had to stand your ground to protect something you love? If you haven't already, please hit that subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. It truly is the biggest compliment you can give to our small channel, and it helps us keep bringing these heartfelt stories to you. Until next time, take care of yourselves, hold your loved ones close, and never forget that your strength is worth more than gold. Have a beautifully blessed day, and I will see you in the next story.